back to the channel. If you're here because you were expecting the final episode of the kitchen series, I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. We're still putting on some final touches, and because I really don't want to make it a 5-parter, you'll have to unfortunately wait for another episode. Instead, we thought it'd be cool to take a look at some data that we've gotten our hands on recently, starting with our solar system. We've had a year of production under our belt now, and I've summarized some of the most important figures in this chart. You can see our consumption in orange, our production in blue, and the average outside temperature in Celsius as the green line. It's nice to see that in most months our production far outpaced our consumption. The only time that was not true was in January, where on one hand we had a lot of consumption due to the kitchen renovation and running the related equipment, as well as a lot of snow that covered the panels for most of the month. The surplus that we've produced has a cash value of roughly $1,400, which we'll be able to cash out annually. And according to the tracking app, the almost 17 megawatt hours we've produced have avoided the equivalent of roughly 12 tons of CO2. Anyway, here's some drone footage. Something else that I've been wanting to do and finally got around to in January was doing a forest inventory. This has been something that had been recommended to me by the county forester in order to derive better management decisions for the forest in the future. I estimate that about 15 acres out of the total 20 acres are accessible enough where I'll be able to manage it long-term in a forestry sense. In our case, that means mainly managing the forest for firewood and wildlife habitat. In order to get a representative sample, I want to sample 10% of this manageable area, so 1.5 acres in total, which I divide into 10 plots of 0.15 acres each. I do some math to determine the radius of the circles that will become my sample plot areas and put them onto a map. I create a little data collection form to make sure that we can effectively record the measurements that we take. Chris is kind enough to join me on this beautiful January morning to head out into the woods. On the way, we collect some old leftover DigSafe flags that we will use to mark and indicate the center of our sample plots. Once we've determined the center of our location, Chris starts walking around in a circle, measuring all the trees that fall inside the sample area. We try to write down the species, which isn't so easy because it's winter and the trees don't have leaves, as well as diameter at breast height, which technically is 4.5 feet above ground, but we're not being super fussy about it. Once all the trees in one sample area have been recorded, I start walking with the tape measure to find our next center point, making sure that the direction I'm walking in is the correct direction to north, which previously had been measured on the map. For our purpose, it's not really critical to find the exact location that has been marked on the map, but more important, that the sample plots are actually truly random, and as we're walking through the forest, we don't have a bias towards places that have particularly large and interesting trees or are easy to access. We discovered pretty quickly that it's much more convenient to use a little optical measurement device with a laser to determine the radius of our sample area and to decide whether trees are in or out, as opposed to walking around with a tape measure and having to navigate all of the trees standing between me at the center point and Chris taking the measurements. We find that about 50% of all trees are red maple, with another quarter being red oak, 10% being white pine, and then a bunch of other species sprinkled in. I'm sure there's some uncertainty and some mistakes in identifying the trees, but as for the overall picture, this should be good enough. When sorting the measured trees by size, you can see that the largest trees are pines, which is not surprising as they're fast growing if we assume that most of this forest has a similar age. I'll definitely be digging into this data a little bit more in the future and sharing how I'm attempting to use it for management decisions. And last, but certainly not least, we get some valuable information about the quality of our well water, which is the main drinking water supply for our family. The city we live in has conducted a workshop at Town Hall and distributed sample kits to enable homeowners to take their own samples and drop them off for analysis. After waiting a few weeks, we get the results back via email, which I'm sharing here now. The short story is that the quality of our well water is really good, with very low values in things like arsenic, PFAS, but unfortunately elevated levels in radon. We're not entirely sure what to do with this information yet, but are looking into doing additional testing of our air quality before we decide on next steps. The last few weeks have been very challenging, with work travel, the ongoing kitchen renovation, and 2 unexpected snowstorms. But nonetheless, we find some time to head outside and enjoy ourselves. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.